But I know that you have attracted the ire of other self-professed learned commentators. Some of them are learned, others maybe less so, for suggesting that we might be living not in a unipolar world, but in a different environment than say at the turn of the century. And I know that there's a trite question which is readily answered, which is, do we need to choose between China and the US? So of course we don't. But there's more to it than that.
There's a lot more to it than that. Well, it's going back to where you started. This is the other side of the question. I'm extremely interested in the kind of armed forces Australia should have and the way we should use them. But in a sense, I'm even more interested in what Australia can and should do to help prevent the evolution of the strategic situation in Asia in which we find ourselves.
The other side of the coin.
It's the other side of the coin. And to ask yourself the circumstances, what are the conditions for peace and stability over the next, say, half century?
Bloody pacifist.
Well, the trick is you ask yourself, well, why has the last 40 years been so peaceful? And my answer is, it's not a coincidence. The last 40 years have been peaceful, whereas the 20 years before that, forward defence, Cold War, Korea, Vietnam War, that was a mess. The 20 years before that, 1930s, 1940s, that was a mess. So why has the last 40 years been so peaceful when the 40 years before that was such a mess? I would say it's because American primacy has been uncontested. Now, it's been uncontested because the Japanese, after 1945,
disarmed
put themselves in a box and said, okay, we're not going to be a strategic player. And the Chinese, after 1972, essentially did the same. Said, okay, we're going to accept America as a dominant power in Asia. Now, this has become so much part of our understanding of the region we live in, we take it for granted. But of course, my big argument is that as power shifts, as China's economy grows, as its power grows on the back of its economy, it no longer accepts American primacy as a foundation for the Asian order. It wants a bigger share of the region. It contests American primacy again, and that's what's happening right now.
And what do you mean by a bigger share of the region?
Well, that's a very good question. What does China want? Let me answer that two ways. The first is, what does it want? You're Xi Jinping. You're lying awake in the middle of the night. What's the China dream? We don't know, of course, and they don't know, but we can take a guess. Because in the end, although China has a very special history and sense of itself and so on, they're not so different from the rest of us. What do they want? They want to be in charge. They want to lead with a capital L. I don't think their model of leading with a capital L is a Stalinist one, sort of like Stalin dominating Eastern Europe or Stalin wanting to dominate the world. I think it's more an American one, actually. My American friends smile when I say this. I think that the sort of deeply embedded Chinese model of its aspirations for leadership in Asia is to do something very like what the Americans have done in the Western Hemisphere under the Monroe Doctrine. That is, you are clearly, unambiguously the leading power. But you don't enforce that leadership in a Stalinist way by occupying other people's countries and running their politics for them and dominating their economies. You just do it by the fact that you're the biggest and you're the sort of major economy and you've got a lot of sort of soft power, but also backed up by military power. But it's sort of semi-consensual or more or less consensual. So I think what the Chinese would like to do would be to have that kind of soft hegemony.
Is there any history of this? Because people who look at China say, well, they haven't had a habit of actually marching into other countries.
Actually, no, they don't have a habit of invading other countries. That's quite right. They do, of course, have a very strong tradition of functioning as a soft hegemon. That's what the whole tributary system and sort of classic Chinese imperial tributary system was all about. You can run your country, but every year you'll come to China and kowtow before the emperor and show that you accept our primacy.
Right.
But I think, I also think we need to be careful not to read too much into the historical metaphors for China. Either way, either the argument that China's a peace-loving country that's never misbehaved, or a country that's always sought to impose sort of, tributary status, impose hegemony on its neighbourhood. Because China, although there are many continuities, has never before functioned as a modern industrial state in a region of modern states. This is essentially a sort of post 1800 phenomenon, the emergence of modern states, we'd even say post-1850 phenomenon in Asia, the emergence of modern states in a modern state system. And so this is the first time China's functioned in a modern state system, and so it's still China in all sorts of ways that, you know, stretch right back into the sort of grand traditions of Chinese statecraft, but it's functioning in a completely different way. And that's one of the reasons why I do tend to look as much to European models as to Asian models when you try to work out what's going on in Asia, because the European state system is by far and away the best sort of bank of data we have about how modern states in the sort of Westphalian model work with one another in a complex multi-state system. And so although you don't want to sort of take Europe and apply it, and as a matter of fact, you know, without wanting to overstate this, if you actually look at the way in which Asia has evolved over the last century, the European models provide pretty good prediction, a basis for prediction. And so I think China, it's sensible for us to expect China to behave in ways which mirror in quite closely the ways in which states in the European state system as they've risen to power.
But they've had two brutal wars.
Well, three if you include the Napoleonic War, or it depends how far back you want to go. I mean, you know, you could say that you know, the wars to contain Louis XIV's bid for primacy in Asia at the end of the 17th century and beginning of the 18th century were very much hegemonic wars in a modern state system. So, in fact, the Europeans have had a lot of wars, but they've had two doozies. That is, two since the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the nature of armed force well and truly came to the fore. And of course, a lot of people argue that that's all happened in Europe, in Asia. That is the sort of a law of nature says that as a power like China rises to challenge an existing leading power like the United States, conflict between them is inevitable. I just don't think that's right, because in the end, the actions and reactions of states are not mediated by the laws of physics, they're mediated by the choices that individuals make.
That's right.
And so individuals can choose to avoid that if they want to.
And there are far better communications too. I don't know how important that is, but
I'm not so sure that the communications are quicker.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure the communications are any better. You know, the United States and China, for example, have endless ways of communicating with one another. But it still remains the case, in my view, that the United States fundamentally misunderstands China's objectives. But extremely sophisticated Americans who speak Chinese perfectly well and have been studying China all their lives still believe that China is going to accept American primacy as a foundation for the Asian order, even as China's economy overtakes America's. Now, I find that, I'm sure it's wrong.
Yeah.
I'm as sure as I've ever been of anything in my professional life.
My point about communications was the Cuban Missile Crisis was solved ultimately by, I think, two people who knew each other, and there was a kind of form of communication behind the scenes, but it was so rudimentary and in some senses lucky. But now at least, you know, if you choose, you can communicate and at least maximise the chances of averting a stuff-up.
I think the means of communication are less important than the approach that each of the parties takes to the message they're going to deliver. And what really made the difference in the 13 days in October was the fact that both Khrushchev and Kennedy clearly understood the risks that were at stake, and clearly understood that they could not assume the other guy would back down. You know, the critical moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis from the American side is the point at which Kennedy, in one of those meetings in the Exco, says, "But what if we attack the Cuban, the Soviet anti-aircraft site?" It was the anti-aircraft missile sites that they wanted to take out, and he said, "We'll kill some Soviets. What will they do?" And Curtis LeMay says, "They won't do anything. They won't do anything." And Kennedy said, "Yes, they will. I can promise you they will. They'll mobilise against West Berlin. And what will we do then? And he describes in a sense the escalation up the ladder to a nuclear exchange. Now, what made a difference was he understood where that might lead, and so evidently did Khrushchev. When Khrushchev wrote the letter about, we're pulling tighter on the knot of war, what he was saying was, he understood that he could not assume the Americans would back down. The Americans understood. Yeah. So they both understood what was at stake. And that meant that both of them were prepared.
Well, they were looking for a communication channel.
Yeah, I mean, and once you decide you really want to communicate, it's not that hard to find a way to communicate. Yeah. But the risk in the US-China relationship is that they don't have that. Both sides believe the other will back down. Mm-hmm. Both sides underestimate the risk of rivalry and conflict. Both are prepared, to my mind, to take very unwise risks. And so I think the US-China relationship is poised in a much more dangerous place than most other people do. I think this is immensely significant for Australia. Australia can't work. We can't have the future we want if the US-China relationship doesn't remain stable, and not just does not go to war, but it doesn't become too adversarial.
Yeah.
And to the point, do we have to choose? We don't want to choose, but whether we have to choose will depend on the way the US-China relationship evolves. Mm. And if anyone thinks that the United States-China relationship might not very probably evolve in a way that requires us to choose, they're kidding themselves. In fact, I think we're already starting to make choices, not the big choice, either go with America or go with China, but the little choices, we do this or we do that, what's the other thing going to think? I mean, we're already at the point where, not in the economic sphere, but in the political and strategic sphere, what Australia does is of interest to each of those countries primarily as it relates to their strategic rivalry with the other. What America looks to Australia to do is how are we aligning with America against China. What the Chinese look to us is how far are we swinging America's way, how far are we staying in the middle. So this is the key issue for both of them. So they judge their relationship with us in terms of what we're doing with the other. We're already making those choices all the time. It's just that we don't always realise it.
Yeah. And they won't always be easy choices to make.
They are extremely... I mean, they are, in fact, in some ways, the most difficult diplomatic and strategic choices we've ever faced. Because, for us, supporting the dominant Anglo-Saxon maritime power in the Western Pacific has always been, since 1788, has always been, for us, the key to our security.
Yeah.
But we've never faced a challenge to that as strong as China's challenge today.
And so what, there is a catalyst, and it might come and go, hopefully it goes, and that is the dispute between China and Japan over disputed territory. The United States is seeking to calm that down. What's your prognosis for all of that?
Well, the first thing to understand about the Senkaku Islands, I'll call it Senkakus, is that it's not really about the islands at all. Mm-hmm. It is about primacy in Asia.
Right. And so it's not about the resources.
It's not about it's
oil reserves.
No, it's not. Oil you can buy.
Yeah.
Serious states don't undertake major conflicts over resources. Mm. It's just economically, it's a dumb way of getting access to oil. You want to buy oil, you can go and buy oil on the open market for whatever the price is today. I think what's driving the Senkakus is China's desire to contest US primacy in Asia, and the strategic and political logic of it is very straightforward. America's primacy in Asia depends on its relationship with Japan. The fact that it has the alliance with Japan is an absolutely essential constituent of America's position in the Western Pacific. America's relationship with Japan depends on Japanese confidence. The United States will always support them. Mm-hmm. As China puts pressure on Japan, in circumstances where the Chinese believe the Americans will be reluctant to support Japan, they hope to undermine Japan's confidence in the US alliance, in the US alliance, therefore undermine the alliance itself, therefore undermine America's position in the Western Pacific. That's why this is so serious. This is not about islands. It's about the deep strategic structure in Asia. And of course, what's embedded in that is a Chinese expectation that the Americans will let Japan down. And I'm not sure they're right about that. They could easily be wrong, in which case we've got one kind of problem. If they are right, if America does let Japan down, then its position in the Western Pacific is undermined. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't for a moment presume that the United States will remain a strong player in Asia. It has choices to make. And in China, it confronts an Asian power which is stronger relative to the United States than any country has ever been. since America itself became a world power. I mean, America became the biggest economy in the world in the 1880s. It very quickly took off like a rocket, partly because of what the Europeans started doing to themselves. By 1900, it was by far and away the world's biggest economy.
Yeah.
China's economy today, pick a number, but it's 75 PPP terms, 75% the size of America's. You can have a little judgment about how the two growth curves are going to go, but sometime in the next decade or two at the outside, China will overtake America to become the biggest economy in the world. That's not inevitable, but it's so far and away the most likely outcome that the other...
Well, its growth rate is 7%
say growth
of
7 and the US is 3, but say China disappoints and gets 6 and America does better and gets 3.5. We're just talking about the timing.
Yeah, that's right.
And this is just 5 years left or right. This is
it's not something that's speculation. It's just when.
And of course, already, right now, China's economy is bigger relative to the United States than the Soviet Union's ever was during the Cold War.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
The Soviet economy was quite hard to manage, to measure. One of the reasons why it's not there anymore, in sort of classic McKinseyan terms. But the smart people who study this thing reckon that the Soviet economy was never more than about half the size of America's.
But did they put enormously disproportionate resources into their military?
They did. They put huge resources into their military, but in the end, they
lost. Which helped bankrupt them.
Of course. In the end, they lost the Cold War because they couldn't make that work.
Yeah.
Worth remembering that China is still spending much lower proportion of its GDP on defence than the United States is today, let alone than the Soviet Union did in the Cold War. But I'm very sort of simple-minded about this. In the end, national power has lots of manifestations, but I think it only has one source, and that is the scale of your economy.
Your economy, yeah.
There's never been a rich country that wasn't powerful, or a powerful country that wasn't rich.
Yeah. And you also made the point, which I've used many times, and with attribution,
of course,
a little asterisk at the bottom, that in the olden days, the countries with the biggest population, when technology, though rudimentary was common across large continents, the biggest populations had
biggest
the biggest economy.
That's right.
And with the Industrial Revolution and that period where productivity went through the roof in the Western countries, they could have a smaller economy, but a smaller population, but a very big economy, dominant economy.
Yeah.
But as countries such as China, Indonesia, and India catch up,
that's right,
with the possibilities that already exist because the technology exists, then they can grow at 6, 7s, and 8s, and the United States and Australia can grow at 3s.
2s and 3s, that's right.
And so it's just
it's a classic,
the way it is.
It's a classic thing.
We're not going to grow at 6, 7s, and 8s.
That's right.
The US isn't going to grow at 6, 7, and 8. And so at one day, I think it's really interesting because you say, so if effectively technology is shared, we go back to where we were, exactly 1,000 years or more ago.
Well, less than that. I mean, I'm no economic historian, but what they tell you is that as late as 1800,
that's right,
per capita productivity globally was roughly equal because everyone, except in Britain, everyone was basically either a semi-subsistence farmer or a craftsman using hand tools, essentially, this sort of stuff. So very little mechanical power and all that sort of stuff. And it's the fact that the Industrial Revolution generated this extraordinary explosion in per capita productivity in industrialised countries. So Britain, by 1810 or something like that, with a population of 20 million, had a bigger GDP than China, then with a population of 300 million. And now, of course, that's swinging back the other way. China's economy overtakes America's to be the biggest economy in the world at the point at which China's per capita productivity becomes 1/4 of America's.
Yeah, that's right.
But its population is 4 times as big. The arithmetic's not very sophisticated, but pretty telling.
Yeah.
And
that's why all this is inevitable.
And that's why, well, I never use the word inevitable, but it's so much more likely than any of the other scenarios that it's hardly worth, from a policy point of view, worrying too much about
the alternative.
It's overwhelmingly the one, and also it's the one that stresses the system.
Yeah.
If China does falter, if China stops growing at only 75% of American GDP, then there'll be all sorts of interesting possibilities. But the shift in the strategic order in Asia will stabilise. But as long as China keeps growing significantly faster than the United States, then the pressure on the present strategic order will grow and grow and grow. And it really is, just a matter of at what point this balloon bursts. And, maybe it can be deflated gently. What we should all hope is that it can be deflated gently. That is, that the regional order can be gradually shifted, peacefully shifted, to something new which accommodates China's growing power. The downside, or the dangerous possibility, is that it grows to the point where it explodes, and we have a violent transformation. And that's what, that might happen in the Senkakus, it might happen in something else. One doesn't want to overstress the 1914 metaphor here, but there are some parallels, because what you see in the years from 1900 to 1914 was a series of crises in Europe in which Germany's pressure on the existing order kept on repeating. The first Moroccan crisis, second Moroccan crisis, first Balkan War, second Balkan War. And by the time you get to Sarajevo, most people, apart from the fact they're all going off on their summer holidays, thought, oh, just another little thing in the Balkans. This one's not a worry, this, poor old Archduke. Nobody looking at that one thought this is the one that will blow the lid off. Yeah. So you see, we might sail through the Senkakus. It might all die down, but the fundamental pressures on the Asian order will persist. Something else will happen somewhere else
because of the rise of China relative to the United States in the region.
Because of fundamental change in the balance. It's as simple as this. As power shifts, relationships change.
Yeah.
The moment the key US objective in Asia is to preserve its relationship with China and its role in Asia unchanged as power shifts. That defies, if you like, the sort of Newtonian physics of politics and strategy. And you can't defy
your critics would say you're a squib because
I think we should compromise with China.
You're talking about compromising with China,
that's right.
And your critics say, well, that will get you to where you don't want to be, which is a conflict or domination.
One has to be extremely careful about compromising with rising powers. That's one of the lessons you do learn from the 20th century. And so I think one needs to be very careful when one starts compromising with rising powers to define what you're not prepared to compromise on. And I think there are some things we should rigorously refuse to compromise on, and one of them is the use or threat of force in changing international settings, which is why I think the Senkaku's thing is so worrying. I think it's possible, far from inevitable, possible that we could say to China, look, you're not going to be strong enough to dominate the whole region. And I don't think it will be. It's going to be the world's biggest economy, probably. It's going to be an immensely powerful state, but it's not going to be strong enough to dominate Asia by itself if others try to resist it. And I think we need to say to the Chinese, look, guys, you're not going to be able to dominate this region. And if you try, you're going to run yourself into escalating strategic rivalry with some very strong and dangerous states. Japan, United States, India, Russia, possibly. So what you need to do is in your interest, your China's interest, to settle for the most you can get at relatively low cost. It's a classic policy choice. And I think that the balance point is a point at which China and the United States and the other great powers, but just look at the China and the United States for the time being, China and the United States build a shared power structure in which they both have, roughly speaking, equal roles. Now that means giving China a lot more power than it's had in the past. It means the United States accepting a much lower position than it's had in the past. But it means the United States continues to play a strong role in Asia, constrains China's power significantly. And it might just give the Chinese enough to satisfy them. They don't have to like it. All they have to do is to say, okay, on balance.
They do a calculation. This is optimum.
Exactly. It's cost benefit.
In mathematics or whatever.
It's a perfectly straightforward economic choice that is,
a constrained.
I'd like to go skiing in Gstaad, but actually Mount Buller is cheaper. And the skiing's, it's 5 times cheaper and the skiing's half as good. So I'll go Buller. Yeah. And so, China would like to dominate the region in a sort of Monroe Doctrine kind of way. But if it's going to face escalating strategic rivalry with countries it can't beat, it makes sense for China to settle for a relationship of equality. Yeah. But my point is, I don't think the Chinese will settle for less. I think the Chinese will be prepared to pay extremely high costs and run very big risks in order to get out of the position of subordination it feels it's in at the moment. And that's, whereas a very common view amongst Americans, and I think a kind of assumption, an unexamined assumption in Australia, is that the Chinese in the end are going to settle for nothing.
Yeah.
No, they're going to settle for no fundamental change in the Asian order at all. And as I said before, I'm sure that's wrong. I'm
so
sure that's
how
wrong.
how would this desired?
We did.
Just want to. You've covered it to an extent, but the desired. You use the word dominance, or at least influence, or how. What would it look like?
Well, we don't know, and that's partly because although you can draw on the historical records, it's the best data set we've got. Each circumstance is unique, if you know what I mean. But my starting point is that when I look at China as a revisionist power, a power that wants to change the international system, I see it as quite modest in its aspirations. You know, when we look at a dominant power, when people think about China's rising power and trying to learn the lessons from the past, we look at Napoleonic France, we look at Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, Maoist China, Japan, Imperial Japan. They're our key models.
Right.
And each of those models were very radical. That is, each of them wanted to fundamentally change almost every feature of the international system. I mean, take Stalinist Russia, for example, Stalinist Soviet Union. They wanted to change the whole global economic structure. I mean, fundamentally. They had a model of the economy.
They wanted the whole show to be communist.
They wanted the whole show to be communist. This is extraordinarily radical. They wanted to fundamentally change the political structure. In every country in the world, they wanted to build a particular, very specialised model of political life. They wanted to change the ideological foundation. They wanted to change the religious foundation. They wanted to change everything.
Well, my Catholic nuns in Baradine used to tell me what
the
Russians are coming, and
those guys in the Kremlin,
they're heathens,
want to close our churches.
That's
now, when people and so when we think about a rising power, and when I say we, I don't just mean we Australians. I think the whole, certainly the West, when it thinks about a rising power, thinks about how to respond to China's rise, views it through a model which is built around this series that we've had in this last couple of centuries of very radical revisionist powers. But when I look at China today, I see a country that is very happy with the present economic structure. 10% per annum over 30 years, who wouldn't be?
Slowing a bit now to
minus 7%. But they don't want to change the economic model. I think they're entirely uninterested in other countries' politics. The Chinese Communist Party does not have a view as to how Australia should be governed. It is completely uninterested in our religious life, our social life, our sport. They don't barrack for the Bulldogs. Exactly, they don't care. So the key thing about the Chinese, actually, most of what goes on in Asia at the moment, they're perfectly happy with. The only one thing about Asia they want to change: who's in charge. Now that's itself pretty radical. Changing who's in charge is a very radical thing to do, but it's much more modest.
And how does who's in charge get manifest? I mean, when people wake up outside of China,
what does it feel like
each morning? What's it feel like that China? Well, gee, it's different now. China's in charge.
If China, well, it's a very important point. It might not be that different. It depends how the Chinese chose to use that power. And see, one of the questions for Australia is how bad would it be for us if China does end up as a dominant power? If the United States withdrew, which as I say, they could do. I don't predict it as a most likely outcome, but it's certainly a possibility we need to bear in mind. So if the United States withdrew, if the Japanese decided on balance that contesting China's primacy is more trouble than it's worth, and decided to kind of accept its, I say that Japan comes a kind of Canada to China's America, if you know what I mean. It's a big country, it's a very important country, but it sort of accepts a position of subordination to China. And I think it's very unlikely that Japan would do that, but they could. If India decides not to contest China's position either, maybe India looks west rather than east, and there's, Middle East is changing very fast, and India's a big place, and so on. There are all sorts of different ways in which that could play out. In that case, we might end up with a region in which China is the Monroe Doctrine power. And we need to ask ourselves, for Australia, what does that feel like? Well, I think it's risky because once China was in that position, its ambitions might become bigger than they are at the moment. When I look at China's ambitions today, they seem modest. Once China actually got hold of the steering wheel, they might decide they wanted to do different things. But it's quite possible that China might just leave us be. It might be a little bit like the United States. If you're we're the Argentina in this model. You know, we're the country that's a long way to the south.
Yeah.
In the Monroe Doctrine model. So, you know, what would be the difference? Where our children would probably tidy up their Mandarin a bit. They would go to study in Beijing instead of going to study at Harvard. But it might be a perfectly natural evolution, but it's risky.
Yeah.
And it's particularly risky, of course, if Japan and India and so on don't decide to accept Chinese primacy. And that seems to me to be the more likely outcome. And that's why I think trying to negotiate a power sharing structure in which the Japanese and the Indians and the Americans all play a role along with China, but which gives China a position of equality in that system, is the safer bet. And
you it seems to me you're ruling out or regarding as negligible the possibility that China would act militarily to achieve this domination in the region.
Well, it's not. China's not going to be strong. Well, China's not going to be strong.
That is, it's not going to go rumbling into countries.
It's not going to do the Nazi Germany thing. Look, I think I see no evidence of that in China. Moreover, it's not to say it couldn't happen, but you know, this is not Nazi Germany. You know, and one of the reasons for that is because China does have a huge stake in stability.
Yeah.
Because the economy is working so well for it, not just its own economy, but the regional economy is working so well for it. China has a strong stake in stability. It also has a stake in asserting leadership, and it's got to manage the tension between those two. But it doesn't feel the tension between those two is as strong as others might, because it thinks it can get there peacefully. But the extent to which China could use armed force if it wanted to depends a lot on the environment you're talking about. On the continent of Asia, in relation to China's smaller neighbours, China always has military options because of its sheer scale. If you're Vietnam or Laos or Burma or Mongolia or Korea, then living next door to China is to live under China's shadow. But as soon as you get offshore, water is a great barrier. And as soon as you get offshore, the stakes change. China has done a great deal over the last few decades to improve its capacity to stop other people projecting power by sea against it. But it has done almost nothing to build its capacity to project power by sea against others. Yeah. So if you're Japan, you can defend yourself against China very easily. The question about nuclear weapons is to one side, but you know, we can come back to that. But if you're Japan, you can defend yourself against China very easily because it's very easy to sink Chinese ships. And so there's a ring of us: Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Australia, and oddly enough, India, because the Himalayas means that India... Barrier, the Himalayas is so hard to drive across that it functions like a significant body of water as a barrier to military operations. And so India and China really relate to one another primarily as maritime powers. And so we offshore powers, you know, around that ring like that, are actually relatively secure from China. That's one of the reasons why it's so hard for China, as I say, to dominate the region. Because so much of Asia's power is offshore. One of the differences between Asia and Europe is that in Europe, the only power that's offshore is Britain. Whereas in Asia, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Australia, India, New Zealand, are all offshore. And in aggregate, it's a pretty big chunk, particularly with India, is a very big chunk of the region's weight.
I understand. Any role for Australia in all of this? I mean, sometimes we get a bit, you know, inflated with our view as to what role we can play between the United States and China. But is there any role?
Sometimes we do, and sometimes we understate it. We have no role as a mediator. That is, we have no role to get between the US and China and sort of talk to them like this. Guys. That's right. That is something in which, you know, the Chinese and the Americans can talk perfectly well to one another, and they do. But we do have an interest in the kind of relationship they build. And we do have, or we should have, influence on both of them. And in particular, we should have influence in Washington. I mean, we keep on talking about this alliance, and it's for real. Australia actually has a significant voice in Washington on these things if we choose to use it. And, you know, if ever anyone in Australia is in any doubt about whether Australia matters to America when America thinks about China, they just have to remember that Barack Obama has given the most important speech that any American president has given about China since 1972 in Canberra. I mean, the Barack Obama speech to the Australian Parliament, November 2011, is seen by the United States, seen by the Obama administration as the key statement on US role in Asia, and a very credible argument. It's the most critical speech on Asian policy since Nixon went to China. Why did he give it here? Because Australia actually does sit in a pretty important place here, where he couldn't have given that speech in Japan.
Yeah.
Because the Japan-US relationship is so complex, and because the Japan-US-China relationship is so complex.
Yeah.
We have a bit of room to manoeuvre. And I think I'd turn the coin over. The evolution of the US-China relationship is the single most critical determinant of Australia's international environment over the next few decades. If it goes well, this country's got a good future. If it goes badly, we're screwed. So we as a national priority should absolutely be aiming to do whatever we can to influence both the US and China.
Yeah.
To build that relationship in a way that works for us. And we shouldn't be, even if we only have a 5% chance of making a difference, why wouldn't we try? You know, what do we say to our grandchildren? If 35 years from now, the region's been ripped apart by a nuclear war between the United States and China, and they ask us, what did you guys do to stop that happening? I mean, there it was. Look at what you were all saying in 2011, 2012, 2013 about this wonderful new age. It all fell apart in 2014, to be pessimistic. What did you do to stop it? And if we say, oh, well, we're sure the Americans really wanted to hear from us.
I don't know if there's a parallel here, but as Trade Minister, it was fascinating. I had the assumption that Australia was a significant but not a big influence in international trade negotiations. But so many countries came to us to ask what we thought.
That's right.
And interestingly, China would do that, and the US would do that. And there was a little bit of them asking what we thought the others thought.
No, look, that's exactly right.
It was sort of more of our position of credibility and acting in good faith that was valuable.
That's exactly right. But also, your influence in these situations depends a great deal on the quality of your ideas.
Yeah.
And if you've got a good idea,
you don't have to be big.
You don't have to be big. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew is one of the best demonstrations of this. But it's also true of us. I mean, we have had some very big wins on the trade front. Ideas like the Cairns Group, ideas like APEC, worked because they were good ideas. Now, you also have to have the tradecraft. You have to take the idea and then you have to turn it into a real diplomacy.
Yeah.
And, Australian trade diplomacy, I think, over the years has been extremely good. But first of all, you've got to have the idea.
Yeah.
And one of the things is that although when we look at Beijing and when we look at Washington, we see these immense sort of monoliths. In fact, both of them are quite open towns. They're open markets for ideas.
Yeah.
Washington, of course, obviously and especially, but I think Australians do underestimate what an open city Washington is. You go to Washington with an idea.
To Washington?
To Washington. And they will listen to you if it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Now, they won't necessarily agree with you. They might give you a hard time, but I mean, I've been arguing a very, to Americans, counterintuitive idea on the future of the US-China relationship. And my sort of shorthand for my reception is, Hugh, I've read your book, completely disagree. We must go to lunch and talk about it. And it really has been the experience. But also in Beijing, it's a more open, Beijing is a town that's full of ideas. There's a lot of debate that goes on there. There are limits around that debate. But can you debate the US-China relationship in China? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And are they interested in Australian views? You bet they are. And so, I think it's a major issue for Australia. We have to work out in our own minds where we want the US-China relationship, what evolution of the US-China relationship works best for us, and do whatever we can to help shape it in that direction. And of course, we're not alone, because everybody else in Asia is facing the same problem.
Yeah.
And everybody else in Asia ends up having the same interests that we do. Look, none of us want to live under China's shadow. So we all want America to stay engaged. None of us want to live with US-China strategic competition. So we all want the United States to stay engaged in a way that China's prepared to accept. So we all want the United States and China to sit down and negotiate some sort of power sharing deal. And, I think one of the opportunities for Australia is not just to go to Washington and Beijing, But to go to Singapore and Jakarta and Seoul and Bangkok and and Delhi and say, and maybe, although this is a more complicated case, Tokyo, and say, guys, we all need to, and for that matter, to Europe. I mean, the Europeans have a huge stake in this. And say, look, we all need to be going to the United States and saying, think about your relationship with China this way. And go to China about, think about your relationship with the United States that way.
Well, we better wind up, but picking up that point, there is evidence that the ASEAN as a group are really, I mean, they've been together for a long time, but again, in the trade area, they came up with this regional comprehensive economic partnership, and it was the ASEANs who came up with that idea. The US has assumed that it's a China idea, and I said, no, actually, it's an ASEAN idea, and the reason I raise that is that it may be possible that we can deal with the ASEANs as a group. I don't know in your field. I do think it is quite possible in the commercial sphere.
Yes, look, I think that's right, but I think in the strategic and political field that's becoming harder. It's not a coincidence that ASEAN's history has coincided with this era of uncontested primacy. That ASEAN has worked as an association of middle and small states because the great powers have agreed to let it work by keeping their hands off it. Now, as soon as the great powers start to become rivals again, one of the ways that rivalry is expressed is by their attempts to pick the ASEANs off
apart and get them to choose.
And both sides have done that. The United States, I think, has quite clearly sought to exploit China's admittedly rather ham-fisted diplomacy in the South China Sea to draw the Southeast Asians closer to them. And the Chinese have sought to use both threats and blandishments to draw Southeast Asians back. And the outcome was right there in Phnom Penh last year. And this is the great powers starting to pull ASEAN apart. And of course, now that ASEAN is big, now that ASEAN stretches from Vietnam and Laos at one end down to Indonesia at the other, these
and
guys
across to Myanmar,
and across to Myanmar. But the really big division in ASEAN is between the continentals and the maritimes. But if you're Indonesia, you've got all sorts of issues about your future relationship with China, but they're very different from Vietnam's. Because the Vietnamese just live with China. Right.
They've had a lot of blues.
They've got several millennia of experience in doing this, but in the end, there are very clear limits to what Vietnam. Nobody can help Vietnam manage their relationship with China. The idea that the United States can help Vietnam manage China is a complete myth. We've been there before. You know, it doesn't work. This is the mainland of Asia. So it's not to say the Vietnamese have to do whatever China says. They certainly demonstrated that in 1978. But they have to always take China into account in a way that Indonesia doesn't, to nearly the same degree, because it's just a lot further away and there's some water in between. So I think the more the region becomes shaped by rivalry between the United States and China, the less effective ASEAN will be in this field.
I understand. I'd love to talk to you in the future sometime about Indonesia.
Yes, that's a whole. But it's a whole added drama in it.
But I think we really should draw this Emmo Forum episode to a close with me asking you if there's one thing that you could change and look your grandchildren in the eye, the ones you described a little earlier. What would it be?
Very important question. Very simple answer. Australia needs to recognise that China's rise fundamentally changes our strategic circumstances and needs to be much more active than we've been so far in trying to shape how those strategic circumstances change. And I think the key way to do that is to start representing to Washington and Beijing the kind of strategic relationship they should have. This is the most important diplomatic challenge Australia has ever faced. It sounds like an exaggeration. It's not.
And you think we can play a role?
And we can play a role.
It sounds like you think we must play a role.
Why shouldn't we give it a try? I mean, I'd rather say to my grandchildren we tried and failed,
and they said go away,
than to say we didn't think it was worth a try. I mean, how weak is that?
Hugh White, Professor
at the
Australian National University, thank you very much for appearing on the
My great pleasure.
Thank you.
And while people get their tax cuts anyway under current policy, there's a hole in the budget. And we have a dreadful problem in our budget looking forward, and it's